The gun was already pressed against Cecil Bailey's temple when Ida Pritchard walked through the saloon doors. She had not meant to be there. She had not meant to be anywhere in Dusthaven, Texas at all. But fate, or something crueler than fate, had a way of arranging itself around a woman who had stopped believing in the kindness of strangers. And now, she stood frozen in the doorway of the Silver Spur Saloon with sawdust under her boots and her heart slamming against her ribs like a trapped animal. The man holding the gun was named Dolph Reuter, and he was the kind of man who filled a room with menace before he even opened his mouth. He was big, broad-shouldered, with a jaw like a quarry stone and eyes that held no warmth whatsoever. He had Cecil Bailey by the collar of his work shirt, and Cecil was on his knees on the floorboards, and there was blood already running from a split above his eyebrow, and he was not begging. That was the thing Ida noticed first, before she noticed anything else. The man on his knees was not begging. "You signed that deed over to me 6 months ago, Bailey," Dolph was saying, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Everybody in this room knows it. You can either confirm that right now or I will do what I came here to do." The room was silent. A dozen men stood along the bar and at the card tables, and not one of them moved. Cecil Bailey lifted his eyes. They were dark brown, steadier than any eyes had a right to be when there was a gun at a man's skull, and they swept the room once before they landed on Ida. He did not know her. She did not know him, but something passed between them in that half-second that she could not name, something that felt like recognition even though it had no right to. "That deed was forged," Cecil said, his voice calm and flat as a winter lake. "Everybody in this room knows that too." Dolph cocked the hammer. Ida moved before she thought about it. She had a carpetbag in one hand, and she swung it hard into Dolph Reuter's gun arm from behind, and the weapon discharged into the ceiling and brought down a shower of plaster dust and splinters that rained over everything. The room exploded into motion. Dolph spun. Cecil lunged upward from his knees and drove his shoulder into the bigger man's midsection, taking them both into a card table that collapsed under their combined weight, scattering chips and cards across the floor. It was over in under a minute. 2 other men in the room, men who evidently knew Cecil and had been waiting for any break in the standoff, grabbed Dolph's arms before he could recover, and the sheriff arrived through the back entrance not 30 seconds later, drawn by the shot, and that was the end of it. Ida was still standing near the door with plaster dust in her dark hair, and her carpetbag clutched against her chest when Cecil Bailey straightened up from the wreckage of the card table and looked at her. "That was either very brave or very foolish," he said. "I have been told those are the same thing," she said. "That was the beginning." But to understand what it meant, you have to understand where Ida Pritchard had come from, and what that journey had cost her, and why she had come to a town called Dusthaven carrying nothing but a carpetbag and a heart that had long since been pickled in disappointment. She had been born in Missouri in 1862, the third daughter of a farmer named Hiram Pritchard, who was not a cruel man but was a weak one, which in Ida's experience amounted to nearly the same thing when it came to the practical business of survival. Her mother had died when Ida was 11, and by the time she was 17 she had learned to cook for 4 people, keep accounts, mend, sew, tend livestock, and read law by candlelight, because she had understood even then that knowledge was the only thing that could not be taken from her. In 1882, at 19, she had married a man named Arlo Crane because he had asked her to, and because she had confused steadiness with goodness. She had been young enough to believe a man who showed up reliably was a trustworthy one. She had learned, over the next 3 years, that Arlo was reliable only in his dishonesty. He borrowed money from people he had no intention of repaying. He signed Ida's name to documents without her knowledge. He told her the debts were under control until the morning 3 creditors arrived at the door, and the sheriff's deputy came an hour behind them. And by that afternoon Ida understood that the house she had kept, and the savings she had protected, and the reputation she had carefully maintained in the community of Carndale, Missouri, were all gone. Arlo had left the previous week. She had not known it at the time. She had thought he was in Jefferson City on business. He was, in fact, in St. Louis, and then he was somewhere else entirely, and Ida never heard his name again except through the mouths of people who wanted the money he owed them. She was 22 years old, in debt she had not accrued, stripped of everything she had worked for, and standing on a doorstep in January with a deputy who had the decency to look ashamed of himself. She went to her sister in Kansas City. She stayed there 8 months, working as a seamstress and learning what happened to a woman's confidence when it was systematically dismantled by a man who had no conscience about doing so. She learned that even kind people looked at a woman whose husband had run off and left her buried in debt with a particular kind of wariness, as though failure were something that could be caught from close proximity. She moved on. She had a gift for moving on, not because she was brave exactly, but because staying in a place where people knew her story felt like being buried alive, and she had enough of herself left to refuse that particular fate. She went to Abilene and worked in a boarding house for 11 months, and saved money, and made no close friends because close friends asked questions, and then she moved on again. She went to a small town in the Texas Panhandle called Farlow, and she stayed there a year and a half, and she was doing well, she thought. She had found work as a bookkeeper for a general store. She had a room above the hardware shop. She had even begun to allow herself to think about a future that was not simply the next town and the next job and the next clean start that inevitably turned out not to be clean at all. And then the man who owned the general store, a widower named Pembroke, had tried to force an arrangement on her that she had not agreed to and did not want. And when she had refused him, he had told the town that she was the one who had made inappropriate advances, and the town had believed him because he had been there for 20 years and she had been there for 18 months, and that was the mathematics of reputation in a small place. So she had packed her carpetbag again. It was the spring of 1886, and she was 23 years old, and she had stopped believing in the idea of a fresh start entirely. She had stopped believing that a place would ever be what it appeared to be when she arrived. She had stopped believing that people would extend to her the basic courtesy of assuming the best, or even the neutral. She had decided, on the road out of Farlow with the Texas wind cutting through her coat, that she would find a town big enough to disappear into, and she would disappear, and she would stop expecting anything from anyone and she would be fine. She had meant to go to San Antonio. She had the route in her head. But the stage had broken an axle 2 miles outside of a place called Dusthaven, and the driver had said they would need to wait 3 days for the part to be shipped in, and she had walked into town with the other 4 passengers and had meant only to find a meal and a bed. She had found the Silver Spur Saloon first, because it was the first building with lights in it, and she was cold and tired, and then she had found the moment that was already underway when she pushed through the doors, and she had swung her carpetbag on instinct, and now she was standing in a room full of settling plaster, dust with a man named Cecil Bailey looking at her like she was a problem he had not anticipated. She would come to understand, very much his problem, in the best possible way. The sheriff's name was Hob Mercer, and he was a rangy man of about 50 with a white mustache and the unhurried manner of someone who had been dealing with trouble long enough to have developed a deep professional calm about it. He took Dolph Reuter away in handcuffs, and he took statements from 3 men who had seen everything, and then he turned to Ida and asked her name and where she was staying. "I don't know yet," she said. "She can stay at the Kellerman place," Cecil said, from where he was pressing a folded cloth to the cut above his eye. "Ruth Kellerman takes boarders." "I can find my own arrangements," Ida said. "I'm sure you can," he said without offense. "But it's 9 at night and Ruth Kellerman's is the only decent boarding house in town and it's 2 streets over, and I can show you the way." She looked at him for a moment. He had blood on his face and sawdust on his shirt and a calm about him that seemed entirely genuine rather than performed, which was unusual enough that it gave her pause. "All right," she said. He led her through the dusty streets of Dusthaven, which was a town of perhaps 400 people, she estimated, built along a wide main street with a courthouse at one end and the Union Pacific Depot at the other. It was larger than Farlow. It had the feel of a place that had decided to survive, which she recognized as a quality distinct from the feel of a place that was merely enduring. "You're not from here," he said as they walked. "No. Where are you headed?" "San Antonio," she said. "The stage broke down outside of town. I'll be here 3 days." He nodded and did not ask anything else for a moment, which she appreciated more than she would have said. "That was a dangerous thing you did in there," he said then. "I know it. Why did you do it?" She thought about that honestly. "Because nobody else was going to," she said. He stopped walking and looked at her, and the street lamp was behind him and she could not quite read his face, but she heard something shift in his voice when he spoke again. "My name is Cecil Bailey," he said. "I run the Cedar Ridge Ranch about 4 miles east of town." "Thank you, Miss Pritchard," she said. "Ida Pritchard." "Thank you, Miss Pritchard," he said. "You are the most unexpected thing that has happened to me in a considerable while." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and they walked on to Ruth Kellerman's boarding house, and he introduced her at the door and touched the brim of his hat and left, and Ida stood in the warm entrance hall of the boarding house and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She was not sure what to call it. It was not hope exactly. It was more like the memory of hope. Like something that had been folded away in a trunk so long that it had creased into an unfamiliar shape, and you were not sure yet if it would ever press out flat again. But it was there, and that was more than she had had walking into Dusthaven an hour ago. She told herself it meant nothing. She was leaving in 3 days. Ruth Kellerman was a widow woman of 45 who ran a clean house and asked very few questions, which Ida considered nearly a perfect set of qualities in a landlady. She had a room with a window that faced east, and a wash basin with clean water, and a breakfast served at 7 that included fresh eggs and biscuits. Ida had not slept that well in 4 months. She woke in the morning with the sun coming through the east-facing window, and lay in the clean bed for a moment with the particular feeling of having arrived somewhere, which was irrational, she told herself, because she had not arrived anywhere except a temporary stop on the way to somewhere else. She had breakfast with 2 other boarders, a traveling salesman named Fitch who was extraordinarily interested in his own opinions, and a schoolteacher named Clara Baines who was 21 and was moving to Dusthaven to take over the school from a teacher who had retired. Clara was bright and eager, and talked about the children she had not yet met with a warmth that Ida found both touching and a little painful, because she remembered being that age and being that certain that the world would reward genuine effort. After breakfast, she walked the main street of Dusthaven, ostensibly to find a post office and send a letter to her sister updating her whereabouts, but actually because she was in the habit of understanding a place before she committed herself to spending 3 days in it. She had learned to read towns the way she read faces. The condition of the streets told you something about the people. The state of the storefront windows told you something about the economy. The way strangers greeted each other on the sidewalk told you everything about whether the place was a community or just a collection of buildings. Dusthaven greeted itself well. The women spoke to each other by name. The hardware store owner stepped outside to help an older man with a heavy box. 2 children ran past her on the sidewalk, and one of them called, "Excuse me, miss," without being prompted by an adult. The streets were not exactly prosperous, but they were cared for, and there was a church with a fresh coat of paint and a school building with new windows, and she noted these things the way she noted everything, carefully, and without allowing them to convince her of more than they demonstrated. She found the post office and sent her letter. She was on her way back to the boarding house when she heard her name. "Miss Pritchard." She turned. Cecil Bailey was crossing the street toward her, and he had a clean shirt on and the cut above his eye had been bandaged properly, and he was carrying his hat rather than wearing it, which she thought was either a mark of respect or a habit, and she was not sure which. He was taller than she had fully registered last night. He was perhaps 30 years old, with the kind of face that came from years of outdoor work, dark from the sun with lines at the corners of his eyes that came from squinting into the distance. He was lean in the way that working men were lean, not through lack of food but through constant motion. He had hands that showed the same story. He was not what anyone would call classically handsome, but there was something in his face that she had noticed in the saloon and noticed again now, which was a quality of attention. He was fully present in a way that some men never were. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning, I hope you slept well." "Very well, thank you." "I wanted to check on you," he said. "After last night, it can shake a person, being in the middle of something like that, even when it works out." She looked at him with genuine curiosity. Most people don't think to check on someone they just met. Most people might not, he agreed. I grew up being told that good manners don't have a time limit on when they apply. I found that to be useful advice. That is unusual advice for the frontier. My mother was not a usual woman, he said, with a slight smile that changed his whole face and made her look at him a moment longer than she had intended to. She asked what had happened with Dolph Reuter because it was a practical question, and because she genuinely wanted to understand the situation she had stumbled into. He told her then, walking beside her back up the main street, the full story of it. He had owned the Cedar Ridge Ranch for 6 years. He had built it from a quarter section of land into something real, with cattle and a reliable water source and a bunkhouse that housed 4 hired men. 18 months ago, Dolph Reuter had arrived in the county with money and ambition, and had begun buying up ranches, some through legitimate purchase and at least 2, Cecil believed, through forgery and coercion. Dolph had targeted Cedar Ridge because of the water. There was a creek that ran through the eastern portion of Cecil's land that Dolph wanted for a larger operation he was assembling to the south. 6 months ago, a deed had appeared in the county records showing that Cecil had sold Cedar Ridge to Dolph for a sum considerably below market value. Cecil had not signed it. He had never signed it. But someone had done a credible job of duplicating his signature, and the county assessor at the time had been a man in Dolph's pocket. And by the time Cecil had discovered it, the paperwork had been recorded and certified, and the legal fight to undo it was going to take months and cost money he did not easily have. So last night he came to demand I publicly confirm the sale, Cecil said. He had gotten wind that I had found a land attorney in San Antonio willing to take the case on, and he wanted to shut me down before the case could be filed. Ida stopped walking. "A land attorney in San Antonio," she said. "Yes." "What is the attorney's name?" He looked at her, slightly surprised. "Fellows, Martin Fellows, on Commerce Street." "I know that name," she said. "He has a good reputation. If he is taking your case, you have a real chance." "You know land law," he said. "I know enough of it," she said carefully. "I had cause to learn." He did not push on that, and she respected him for it. They had reached the boarding house gate, and she paused there with her hand on the iron latch. "Mr. Bailey," she said, "that forged deed. Do you still have the original survey paperwork from when you filed your land claim?" "I do." "Does your original survey predate Reuter's alleged purchase by more than 30 days? He thought about it. "By about 8 months. "Then you have prior documentation of ownership established by your own recorded claim. A competent attorney can use that to demonstrate the deed was created retroactively. The forgery would have had to have been executed before your original claim recording if it were legitimate, which is impossible since you filed that claim yourself. There's an internal logic problem in the forged document that works in your favor." He was staring at her. "How do you know that?" She had learned it, she did not say, from reading law books by candlelight in a Missouri farmhouse when she was 17, and then from desperate necessity, when a man named Arlo Crane had taught her that ignorance of legal matters was a form of vulnerability she could not afford to carry. "I read a great deal," she said instead, and went inside. She spent the rest of that first day exploring Dusthaven more thoroughly and working very hard at not thinking about Cecil Bailey, with mixed results. The town had a lending library of sorts, a back room of the general store where the owner, a practical woman named Annette Church, had organized about 300 volumes that residents could borrow on the understanding that they were returned within a reasonable period. Ida spent an hour there and came out with a novel and a surveying manual and a deep, reluctant pleasure at having found such a thing in a town of this size. She had dinner at the boarding house and talked with Clara Baines about the school curriculum and about what books might be appropriate for children of various ages, and it was a good conversation, easy and genuine, and she found that she liked Clara very much, which was something she had not allowed herself to do with someone new in quite a long time. After dinner, she sat by the east window in her room and read the novel and watched the last light go out of the sky and listened to the sounds of a town settling in for the night. And she thought about how she had told herself she would disappear into San Antonio, and she thought about how she had been here only one full day, and something about Dusthaven was already feeling like more than a stop on the way to somewhere else, and she did not entirely trust that feeling. She trusted it less when, on the second morning, Cecil Bailey arrived at the boarding house at 8 in the morning and asked Ruth Kellerman if Miss Pritchard might be willing to come out to Cedar Ridge Ranch and look at his deed records. She should have said no. She was leaving the following day. She said yes. He came with a buckboard wagon, which was sensible for the road, and they drove east out of town into the open country of central Texas, which in late April was doing its best impression of paradise. The mesquite was putting out new leaves, and the wildflowers were coming in along the roadside, bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush, and the yellow of Wesachi blooms. And the sky was that deep, uncompromised blue that you only ever got this far west. And Ida sat on the buckboard seat beside Cecil Bailey and felt something alarming happening in her chest that she was choosing, for the moment, to ignore. He told her about Cedar Ridge as they drove, and his voice changed when he talked about the land, became more open and unhurried, the way a person's voice changed when they talked about something they genuinely loved. He had come to Texas from Georgia in 1878, at the age of 22, with $200 and a horse. He had worked as a hired hand for 3 years on a large operation near Waco before he had saved enough to stake his own claim under the Homestead Act provisions. He had built the main house himself, with help from 2 neighbors, over the course of one summer. He had started with 20 head of cattle and had worked it up to nearly 200. He was not rich, but he was solvent and he was building something, and the thing Dolph Reuter was trying to take from him was not just the land but the 6 years of labor and intention that had made it what it was. "Do you have family?" she asked. "A brother in Georgia, younger than me by 4 years. My parents passed, my mother in '82 and my father the following year. I send money to my brother when I can, but he's doing all right." "No wife," she said, and then felt her face warm slightly because she had not intended to say it quite that directly. He glanced at her with a look that was almost amused but not quite. "No," he said. "I was engaged once a few years back. It didn't take." She decided not to ask more about that, and he did not offer more, and they drove on in a comfortable silence that she found, to her own mild alarm, genuinely comfortable rather than merely tolerable. Cedar Ridge was beautiful. She had not expected it to affect her the way it did, but it was the kind of place that reached into some quiet part of a person and held on. The main house was solid timber and stone, set on a slight rise with a view of the creek to the east. There were cottonwood trees along the water, enormous old ones that cast real shade, and a kitchen garden that someone was already working, and a corral with 4 horses that came to the fence when the buckboard came through the gate. One of the hired men, a lean Mexican man of about 40 named Rogelio, came out to take the horses, and he greeted Cecil with the familiarity of someone who had worked with him for years, and looked at Ida with open curiosity and entirely respectful restraint, which she appreciated. Cecil took her inside and spread his deed and survey records across the kitchen table, and she sat down and read them carefully, and he sat across from her and watched her read without interrupting, which was exactly the right thing to do, and she noted it. The records were as he had described. His original land claim survey was dated August of 1880. The forged deed of sale was dated February of 1885. But the forged deed referenced land boundaries that were not established in the county records until a subsequent survey done in late 1881. If the deed were genuine, Bailey would have been selling land using a boundary description that did not exist yet at the time of the alleged sale. She looked up and told him this, explaining the logic carefully, and watched his face as he followed it. So the forgery was done by someone who knew the later survey but not the original, he said. Exactly. They used the more detailed boundary description because it was more official sounding, but by doing so, they revealed that the document couldn't have been created when it claims to have been. Your attorney in San Antonio needs to argue this as the central defect. Write it down for me, he said quietly, please, exactly as you just explained it. She found paper and a pen in the kitchen and wrote it out in her clear, precise hand, 3 paragraphs laying out the logical problem in the forged deed. He read what she wrote twice and then looked at her for a long moment. Miss Pritchard, he said, can I ask you something personal? You can ask. How does a woman coming through Texas on a broken-down stage happen to know this much about land deed law? She set down the pen. She looked at the paper on the table rather than at him. I had a husband, she said. He is gone now, and not by death. He signed my name to documents I had not seen and left me responsible for debts I had not made. I had to learn the law very quickly and very thoroughly because ignorance would have destroyed me. It still nearly did. The silence in the kitchen was complete and very still. I'm sorry, Cecil said, and the way he said it was different from how people usually said it. He did not say it with pity, which she could not bear, or with the awkward embarrassment that people usually showed when she told them any part of this story, which she almost never did. He said it the way you said it when you understood that something genuinely terrible had happened to a person and you wanted them to know that you saw it clearly. It was some years ago, she said. I've managed. I can see that you have, he said. Very well by the look of it. She gathered herself and changed the subject, asking about the water rights attached to the creek, and he answered her and they went back to the business of the documents, but something had shifted between them and they both knew it. He made her lunch. He cooked over the kitchen stove with the competent ease of a man who had lived alone for years, salt pork and beans and cornbread, and they ate at the kitchen table with the April light coming through the window. And she talked about Missouri and he talked about Georgia, and she asked about the cattle and he asked about her reading. And she laughed once, genuinely, at something he said about a particular stubborn steer who had a talent for escaping any enclosure that Cecil built. It was not until she caught herself laughing that she realized how long it had been since she had done it. He drove her back to town in the late afternoon, and the drive back was different from the drive out. Something had loosened between them, some invisible formality, and they talked more easily and he made her laugh again twice. And when they reached the boarding house gate and he helped her down from the buckboard, she was aware that she did not want to go inside. Your stage leaves tomorrow morning, he said. At 9. He looked at her with that steady, full-attention look that she had noticed from the beginning. I know it's not my place to ask, he said. And I would not for a moment suggest that your plans are not your own to make. But I find that I would like very much to see you again after tomorrow, and I don't know how to make that a possibility unless I ask directly. She looked up at him. The evening was coming in soft and warm, and there were mockingbirds in the cottonwood on the street corner, and she could feel her own pulse in a way that was inconvenient and real. Mr. Bailey, she said, I have been in 3 towns since my husband left. In every one of them I tried to begin again, and in every one something drove me out. I have come to believe that a fresh start is something that happens to other people. I have found, he said carefully, that a fresh start is less about the place and more about what you decide to do in it. That is very philosophical for a cattle rancher. I read too, Miss Pritchard, he said with that almost smile. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the boarding house 2 streets over from the school that would soon have a new teacher. She thought about Annette Church's lending library in the back of the general store. She thought about the breakfast she had eaten that morning, fresh eggs and biscuits, and the mockingbirds, and the way this town had greeted itself on the street. "I don't have a position here," she said. "Annette Church has been looking for someone to manage her accounts for 6 months. I happen to know that because she mentioned it to the mayor 3 weeks ago in my presence." "You are a very prepared man," she said. "I had a feeling you might need a practical reason," he said. And that was when she understood that he had been thinking about this before today, which was alarming and also warm in a way she could not easily dismiss. She did not make him a promise. She did not stay the stage at 9 in the morning. She got on it as planned, with her carpetbag and her 3 paragraphs of legal analysis that she had written out in duplicate, keeping 1 copy for herself. She got as far as the first way station, which was 11 miles south of Dusthaven. She sat in the way station for 45 minutes while the horses were changed, and she stared at the wall, and she thought about every town she had left, and every town she had arrived in, and every time she had told herself that this new place would be different, and then found that it was not. She thought about the way Cecil Bailey had said "I'm sorry" when she told him about Arlo, and the way it had landed differently from every other person who had ever said it. She thought about Annette Church's lending library, 300 volumes in the back of a general store. She thought about Clara Baines, 21 and bright and new to the town herself, which meant Ida would not be the only new face, and sometimes the arithmetic of belonging was simpler than it seemed. She got off the stage at the way station, and she asked the station keeper if she could hire a ride back to Dusthaven. He looked at her with mild surprise and said he could manage that for $1.25. She paid it. She arrived back in Dusthaven at noon and went directly to Annette Church's general store and asked about the bookkeeping position. Cecil Bailey came into the store at 3:30 to buy supply goods and stopped dead in the doorway when he saw Ida at the counter with a ledger open in front of her and a pencil in her hand. She looked up at him. "I decided," she said. He crossed the store floor in 4 strides, and he did not say anything for a moment, just stood on the other side of the counter looking at her with something in his face that was very close to undisguised relief, and then he said, quietly enough that Annette Church at the far end of the store probably could not hear, "I am very glad to hear it." "Don't make too much of it," she said. "I'm trying out the position." "Of course," he said, perfectly solemnly, and she could see him working not to smile, which made her want to smile herself, which she suppressed with effort. She settled into Dusthaven over the next 3 weeks, and it was not entirely smooth, because nothing was ever entirely smooth, but it was better than she had expected. The position at Annette Church's store was real work, and she did it well, and Annette was a straightforward woman who paid a fair wage and did not patronize her about the ledgers, which Ida found she was better at than even she had estimated. The boarding house was comfortable, and Ruth Kellerman was quietly kind. Clara Baines started at the school the 2nd week of May, and came home in the evenings with chalk dust on her sleeves and stories about her students that made dinner conversation genuinely entertaining. Ida found she was looking forward to dinner at the boarding house, which was not something she had felt about any meal in years. The only difficult part was the talk. There was always talk when a new woman settled in a town, and Dusthaven was no exception. She heard some of it indirectly, through the particular quality of silences that fell when she walked into conversations, and some of it more directly through Annette Church, who had the rare quality of reporting the town's opinions to Ida in a factual and non-malicious way, as information rather than weapon. Some people wondered why she had come back after getting on the stage. A few of the older women connected her return with the fact that she had been seen twice in the company of Cecil Bailey, and those women had opinions about that which they did not keep entirely to themselves. One woman, a Mrs. Garland, had made a remark in the dry goods section of Annette's store within Ida's earshot that she considered pointed enough to require addressing directly. "Mrs. Garland, Ida had said, coming around the shelf aisle with a bolt of muslin in her arms. "I would rather you say whatever it is directly to me than in a place you thought I couldn't hear. It is more efficient, and I find I prefer honest conversations to performed ones." Mrs. Garland had looked startled enough to be genuine, and then something in her face had shifted toward respect. "I don't mean you harm," Mrs. Garland said, which was not an apology but was something. "I'm protective of Cecil Bailey is all. He's a good man and he's had a hard time of it with this Reuter business." "I agree with you completely," Ida said. "On both counts." They looked at each other for a moment, and then Mrs. Garland had nodded once, with the air of a woman revising a judgment, and moved on. Ida had learned that directness, properly applied, was a better tool than any amount of gentle maneuvering. Cecil came to town every Saturday for supply runs, and after the first 2 Saturdays, he began stopping at the store to see her before he did anything else. And after the 3rd Saturday, he asked if she would like to take a walk while the supply wagon was being loaded, and she said yes. After the 4th Saturday, he asked if she would allow him to take her to dinner at the hotel restaurant, which was the only proper dinner establishment in town, and she thought about it for only a moment before she said yes. The dinner was formal by Dusthaven standards, which was to say there were tablecloths and candles, and the menu was handwritten on a small card, and Cecil wore his good jacket and Ida wore the green dress that she had bought with her 2nd week's wages and altered to fit her properly. And they sat across a table from each other in a restaurant that 3 other couples were also using, which meant they had privacy without isolation, which suited her. He told her that night about the land case. He had sent her written analysis to Martin Fellows in San Antonio, and Fellows had responded that it was precisely the argument he needed, and had immediately filed an injunction to halt any transfer of the property pending the outcome of the case. Dolph Reuter's attorney had objected, but the judge had granted the injunction, which meant Cedar Ridge was Cecil's in practice while the legal process unfolded. "Your analysis may have saved my ranch," he said. "Your attorney saved your ranch," she said. "I only gave him the argument that neither he nor I had seen until you identified it," he said. She allowed this and moved on, and they talked about other things, and he told her about a particular book he had been reading, A History of the Cattle Trade, and she told him about the novel she had taken from Annette's lending room, and they disagreed pleasantly about whether the protagonist of the novel had made the right choice at its climax, and she realized at some point during that argument that she was genuinely enjoying herself in a way that was not complicated, not guarded, not performed. She was simply there with him, and it was good. He walked her back to the boarding house afterward and stood at the gate, and the evening was warm and the stars were very clear, and he said, "Miss Pritchard, I want to tell you something, and I want to tell you that I am not saying it to pressure you in any direction." "All right," she said. "I have not felt this way about anyone in 6 years," he said. "I don't say that to make you feel obligated to anything. I say it because I think honesty is something that should happen early in whatever this is, so neither of us has to wonder where the other one stands." She was quiet for a moment. The stars were very clear, and the mockingbirds were at it again somewhere on the street. "I am afraid," she said, because she had decided some years ago that if she was going to be honest, she was going to be genuinely honest and not just the comfortable kind. "Not of you, of how wrong things can go when they appear to be going right." "I know," he said. "I am asking you to give this a chance anyway. I'm not asking you to trust me all at once. I'm asking you to allow for the possibility." She looked at him in the starlight for a moment. "I will allow for the possibility," she said. He smiled then, a real one, and it did what his almost smiles promised it would do to his face, and she went inside before it could do anything more complicated to her composure. June came in hot and bright, and Dusthaven went about its business, and the business of Ida Pritchard's heart was conducted with the same careful thoroughness that she applied to Annette Church's ledgers, which is to say she examined every entry and made sure the numbers balanced before she committed anything to ink. Cecil Bailey was, as far as she could determine, exactly what he appeared to be. He was honest in a structural way, built into how he operated rather than something he performed for an audience. He was patient with the people who worked for him and firm about what he needed from them. He was liked in Dusthaven without being indiscriminately popular, which she thought was a better indicator of character than pure popularity, which in her experience often indicated a talent for telling people what they wanted to hear. He was also, she discovered over several more Saturday dinners and 2 visits to the ranch, surprisingly funny. He had a dry, quiet sense of humor that didn't announce itself, and she often didn't realize she had been genuinely made to laugh until she was already laughing, which was a kind of trick she had not seen before and was not sure how to defend against. She stopped trying to defend against it somewhere around the 3rd week of June. She let herself look forward to Saturdays. She let herself think about him on days when he wasn't there. She let herself accept, quietly and without fanfare, that the thing she was feeling was real. The Reuters situation came to a head in July, and it was ugly before it was resolved. Dolph had been in the county jail on the charge of assault with a firearm for 2 months, and his attorney had been working to get him released on bond, and he succeeded in mid-June, which meant Dolph was out and angry, and the legal case was still pending. Martin Fellows had warned Cecil that Reuter might try something before the case was decided, and Fellows was right. On a Wednesday morning in the 1st week of July, one of Cecil's hired men, a young man named Jeb, rode into town at a near gallop to find Cecil, who happened to be at the store talking to Ida when Jeb arrived. Jeb reported that men had arrived at the Cedar Ridge property line that morning and were attempting to remove the survey markers on the eastern boundary near the creek, replacing them with new markers that shifted the line in Reuter's favor. Cecil's face went very still. He looked at Ida for one moment and then at Jeb. "Go get Sheriff Mercer," he said to Jeb. "Tell him what you told me. I'll meet him at the east boundary." "Cecil," Ida said. He looked at her. "Don't go there ahead of the sheriff," she said. "They want a confrontation that can be characterized as a violent dispute over property. Don't give them one." He held her eyes for a moment. She could see the impulse to do otherwise working through him and then settling. "You're right," he said. "Jeb, tell Mercer I'll meet him there and I won't arrive before him." She spent the hours of that morning doing the most meticulous bookkeeping of her life, because it was the only thing that kept her hands from shaking. She had no claim on him, she told herself. They were in an early romance that had not been formally named or declared. She should not feel this frightened on his behalf. She felt very frightened on his behalf. Mercer and Cecil arrived at the east boundary at the same time, with 2 of Mercer's deputies. Reuter's men, 3 of them with new survey stakes and fresh tools, had no legal authority to alter the markers on property under active court injunction, and Mercer pointed this out in the particular tone of a man who was going to be obeyed. 2 of Reuter's men backed down immediately. The 3rd argued, and Mercer arrested him for interfering with court-protected property, which was a charge that stuck, and it sent a message to Reuter that Dusthaven's law was not in his pocket the way the previous county assessor had been. Cecil came back to the store at noon. He came through the door and stopped when he saw Ida, and they looked at each other across the store, and then she walked around the counter and he met her halfway, and she put her hand on his arm and said, "Are you all right?" And he put his hand over hers and said yes, and that was the first time they had touched since he had helped her down from the buckboard wagon that day in April, and neither of them moved for a moment. "I waited," she said. "I was concerned." "I know," he said. "I thought about that, about you waiting. I found it was a powerful incentive to do the sensible thing." She laughed, a little breathlessly, and Annette Church at the far end of the store diplomatically began making a great deal of noise, reorganizing the crockery shelf. The land case was decided in Cecil's favor in August, 6 weeks after Reuter's surveyors had been removed from the east boundary. Martin Fellows presented the boundary description discrepancy that Ida had identified, and the judge found it to be conclusive evidence of a retroactively fabricated document. The forged deed was voided. Cedar Ridge was Cecil's without contest. Dolph Reuter left the county before the week was out. He had other legal problems accumulating, including a separate forgery case brought by another rancher whose land he had taken, and the combined weight of them apparently made Dusthaven an uncongenial place to remain. He went east, and nobody in the county was sorry to see him go. Cecil rode into town the day after the decision was announced, and he found Ida at the store, and he said, "Come to dinner tonight. I want to celebrate properly." "All right," she said. They went to the hotel restaurant again, and this time there were no tablecloths, but there was good food and very good company. And somewhere during the meal she realized that she had stopped watching herself from the outside. That anxious monitoring she had been doing since April, measuring her own feelings against some standard of safety that she had established after Arlo Crane had dismantled her life. She had stopped monitoring, and she was simply there, fully and without reservation, and it was terrifying, and it was also the best she had felt since she was young. After dinner he walked her home as always, and at the gate he stopped and turned to her and took her hands in his, and the August night was very warm, and the stars were the same stars as ever, and she was absolutely still. "Ida," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name without the formality of Miss in front of it, and it landed somewhere in her chest with the kind of weight that announced its importance. "I love you," he said. "I want you to know that without any uncertainty. I know we have known each other only since April, and I know that you have good reasons to be careful, and I am not asking you to say anything in return or do anything in response. I just want you to know." She looked at him for a long moment, the stars, the warm night, his hands, which were the hands of a man who built things, wrapped around hers. "I love you too," she said. "I have been aware of it for some time, and I have been working up to saying it, which I realize is probably obvious to anyone paying attention. I have been paying very close attention," he said. Then he kissed her, gently and with great care, the way a person approached something they did not want to damage, and she kissed him back without the careful reserve she had been keeping. And when they separated, she was slightly breathless, and his forehead came down to rest against hers, and they stood there for a moment in the warm dark, and she thought, with a kind of quiet astonishment, that this was what it was supposed to feel like. This was what she had not had and had stopped believing in. He proposed to her in September, and she said yes. She had thought about it long before he asked, because Ida Pritchard thought carefully about consequential things, and she had examined the question from every angle she could identify, looking for the hidden motive or the trap or the dark past that would reveal itself in retrospect. She had found nothing except a man who was consistent and decent, and loved her in a way that showed itself in daily actions rather than proclamations, which was the kind of love she had decided was the only kind worth having. The engagement was brief and practical, and she did not mind that it was brief, because she had not been interested in a long engagement, which seemed to her like postponing the thing you had already decided to do. They were married in October at the Dusthaven church, with Ruth Kellerman and Annette Church and Clara Baines and Rogelio and the other hired men from Cedar Ridge and most of the town present, because Dusthaven had developed the opinion that this was something to celebrate, and she was touched by that more than she had expected to be. Mrs. Garland gave her a quilt that she had made herself, done in blue and white, and Ida thought of that moment in the dry goods aisle where they had taken each other's measure, and she thanked Mrs. Garland genuinely, and Mrs. Garland pressed her hand, and said she was glad Cecil had found someone with sense. Cecil's brother Thomas came from Georgia for the wedding, a younger version of Cecil with more laughter in him, and a frankness that Ida liked immediately. Thomas stayed 2 weeks and spent most of it helping repair the barn roof, which needed doing, and telling her stories about Cecil as a young man in Georgia that made her laugh in ways Cecil found both embarrassing and secretly pleased by. She moved to Cedar Ridge after the wedding, and it became her home in a way that was different from any place she had lived since childhood, which was to say she stopped seeing it as something she might have to leave. She planted things in the kitchen garden with the intention of harvesting them. She began a project of cataloging and organizing the ranch's financial records, which were in a state of cheerful disorder, and Cecil watched her work at this with undisguised admiration and the occasional humble suggestion that she found she was usually happy to incorporate. Rogelio's wife, a woman named Esperanza, came out to the ranch twice a week to help with laundry and cooking, and she and Ida developed a friendship that was direct and warm and based on mutual respect and shared practical competence. Esperanza spoke to her in Spanish sometimes, and Ida had learned some Spanish in Kansas City from a neighboring family and built on it now, and Esperanza was generous in her teaching, and the two of them established a comfortable domestic alliance that Ida thought of as one of the genuine pleasures of her new life. Winter came to the ranch, and she was not afraid of winter, having grown up with Missouri winters, and Texas winters were not nearly as severe. She and Cecil had evenings by the fire with books and quiet conversation, and she understood something during those evenings that she had not understood before, which was that companionship, genuine and uncomplicated companionship, was itself a kind of luxury she had not known how to value until it was present. She told him about Arlo Crane in full, one of those evenings, the whole story without the careful editing she usually applied. She told him about the debts and the signatures, and the morning the sheriff's deputy had come to the door, and she told him about Kansas City and Abilene and Farlow, and the man named Pembroke who had misrepresented what had happened between them, and about how she had gotten on a stage going to San Antonio, and how she had gotten back off it 11 miles down the road. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Every single thing that happened to you was done to you, not by you. I want to be sure you know that I understand the difference." She had to set down her book and look at the fire for a moment, because her eyes were doing something she did not want to deal with in front of him, except that in fact she did not mind dealing with it in front of him, which was itself something remarkable. "I know you know the difference," she said. "That is one of the reasons I married you." Spring came back, and with it the anniversary of her arrival, and she stood in the kitchen garden of Cedar Ridge Ranch in late April and looked at the cottonwood trees along the creek, which were putting out their new leaves again, and she thought about the woman who had walked into a saloon a year ago with a carpetbag and no expectation of anything except another temporary stop in a life of temporary stops. She thought about what she had told Cecil that first night at the boarding house gate, that she had come to believe fresh starts were something that happened to other people. She had been so wrong about that. Not naively, not in a way that embarrassed her because she had earned her skepticism through real experience and it had been rational given what she had lived through, but still wrong. She had been wrong about this town and she had been wrong about this man and she was not sorry about it. She was, in fact, profoundly and practically grateful for the broken stage axle. That summer, she discovered she was pregnant. She told Cecil on a Thursday evening after dinner, standing in the kitchen while he was washing up at the basin, and she said his name, and he turned and looked at her face and went still the way he went still when something important was happening. "We are going to have a child," she said. He set down the washing cloth and crossed the kitchen and held her, and she felt him breathe out the long breath of a man who had not known he was holding something until he could let it go. "Are you all right?" he said against her hair. "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. "I am a little frightened and very happy, which seems like the appropriate response to this particular situation." "That is exactly the appropriate response," he said. "Those are precisely the two things I am feeling as well." She wrote to her sister in Kansas City, and she wrote to Thomas in Georgia, and the ranch crew took the news with the particular warmth that men who had worked alongside a man for years felt when that man's life was going in the right direction. Rogelio shook Cecil's hand with both of his own, and Esperanza embraced Ida, and said something in Spanish that Ida mostly understood and entirely approved of. Clara Baines threw a small celebration at the school building, inviting Ida and Ruth Kellerman and Annette Church and Mrs. Garland and a few other women from town, and Mrs. Garland had made a cake that was slightly lopsided but very good, and Ida sat among these women in the schoolroom where Clara taught and felt that she was part of something, a community, not by accident or convenience but by her own choices, and by the accumulated weight of showing up honestly in a place that had been willing to meet her honestly in return. Their son was born in March of 1888, on a cold, clear morning after a labor that was long but manageable, with the midwife from town and Esperanza present, and Cecil waiting in the next room with the particular tension of a man who understood completely that there was nothing useful he could do, and was working very hard at accepting this fact. The baby was healthy and loud and dark-haired, and they named him James Hiram Bailey, James for no one in particular and Hiram for Ida's father, who was not a strong man but who had loved his daughters, and she thought he deserved to have a grandson named for him. When Cecil held James for the first time, he looked at the baby with an expression that Ida had never seen on his face before, a kind of open and unguarded wonder, and she watched him from the bed and felt something settle in her chest, some last small uncertainty that she had been carrying without fully acknowledging, the deep hidden fear that this life was still somehow provisional, still something that could be taken away. It settled and was still. This was real. She was here. She was home. James was a vigorous and opinionated child who began walking at 10 months and speaking in full sentences before he was 2, and who had Cecil's steadiness and Ida's habit of examining everything carefully before accepting it. He was devoted to Rogelio, who taught him to identify horses by their gaits before he was old enough to ride one, and to Clara Baines, who had become a permanent and beloved fixture of their lives, and who was the child's unofficial aunt in all the ways that mattered. Ida continued her work managing the ranch's accounts, which had expanded along with the operation. Cecil had increased the herd to nearly 400 head by 1889, and had taken on a contract to supply beef to a military outpost to the south, which required more careful record-keeping than ever. She handled the supply contracts and the payroll and the correspondence with buyers, and she found that the skills she had accumulated through necessity across 3 states in 10 years had assembled themselves into something that was genuinely useful and valued, which was not something she had ever quite allowed herself to believe they would. There were difficult things, because there were always difficult things. A drought in the summer of 1889 killed a portion of the herd, and required them to draw on reserves they had been building, and it was a stressful season. She had managed money under pressure before and did so again without panic, sitting at the kitchen table with the ledgers, and making the calculations that told them where they were and what they could sustain, and Cecil sat beside her and worked through it with her, and they came through it with the operation intact and a clearer sense of how to manage for dry years in the future. In 1890, their daughter was born, red-faced and furious from her first breath and entirely herself from the beginning. They named her Me after Cecil's mother, and James, who was 2 years old and had not been informed that he was going to share his parents with anyone, regarded his new sister with initial suspicion that converted within a week to proprietorial devotion. He sat beside her wherever she was placed and reported on her condition to any adult who would listen. Me grew into a child who was very like Ida in the directness of her communication and very like Cecil in her patience with people, which was a combination that Ida found deeply entertaining to watch developing. Thomas came from Georgia again in 1891, this time with a wife of his own, a lively and intelligent woman named Dora, and the 2 families crowded into Cedar Ridge in a way that was loud and warm, and exactly the opposite of the quiet, ordered solitude that Ida had resigned herself to in the years before she had come to Dusthaven. She looked across the dinner table at the assembled faces, Thomas and Dora and James with gravy on his shirt, and me being prevented from putting her hand in the bread by Rogelio's gentle intervention, and Cecil at the far end of the table catching her eye with the look that was only hers, and she thought about the woman who had stepped off a buckboard with a carpetbag and no expectations. She could not entirely recognize that woman anymore. Not because she had changed in her essential nature, because she had not. She was still precise and direct and slightly suspicious of declarations that weren't backed by evidence. She still preferred honest conversations to comfortable ones. She still read too much and formed strong opinions about novels. But the fear that had been running underneath everything, the constant low hum of waiting for the next thing to be taken away, for the next place to reveal itself as merely another temporary arrangement that was gone. It had dissolved gradually and thoroughly, and she had not noticed it leaving until one day she had reached for it, that habitual anxious monitoring, and found it simply was not there anymore. Dusthaven had done that. This ranch had done that. And this man, this patient, honest, quietly funny man at the end of the table, had done most of it, by being reliable not in the Arlo Crane way, which was the reliability of someone who showed up so that they could take something, but in the way of someone who showed up because he understood that showing up was what love actually looked like when it was real. The county built a new road east of town in 1892 that passed within a mile of Cedar Ridge, which improved their supply runs considerably and also brought more traffic through the area, which brought new settlers, which meant Dusthaven grew. A bank opened. A second church. A doctor arrived who was young and serious and set up a proper practice 2 streets from the school. Clara Baines married the doctor, whose name was Arthur Pritchard, in the spring of 1892, and Ida stood beside her at the church and held her flowers and felt the particular pleasure of watching someone you loved step into a good thing. Annette Church retired from the general store that year and sold the business to a young couple from Kansas, and before she left, she gave Ida the entire lending library, 312 volumes by that point, because she said Ida was the one who would make best use of them, and she was not wrong. The books went to Cedar Ridge and were installed in shelves that Cecil built along the sitting room wall over 2 weekends, and James began working through them systematically by the time he was 5, which his parents found both impressive and slightly exhausting. In 1893, Ida became pregnant for the 3rd time, and this child came in November, another boy, and they named him Thomas after Cecil's brother, which Thomas received with great emotion when he heard, and little Thomas grew up to be the most like his mother of the 3 children, precise and deliberate and ferociously good at arithmetic. By the time Thomas was born, Ida Pritchard Bailey had lived at Cedar Ridge for 7 years, and the ranch and the town had become so completely hers that she could not feel the edges of where they ended and she began, which she understood was what belonging felt like when it was real rather than performed. She still thought sometimes about the woman she had been on that road out of Farlow with the Texas wind cutting through her coat, the woman who had decided that fresh starts were for other people and that she would settle for disappearing into something large enough to absorb her. She thought about her without judgment, that woman, because she had earned her conclusions through real experience and real pain, and the conclusions had been wrong but they had been honest, which was more than could be said for most errors. What she had not known, standing on that road, was that the difference between a genuine fresh start and all the false ones was not the place or the circumstances or even the people, though the people mattered enormously. It was something in herself that she had not yet been able to access, some capacity for trust that had been methodically damaged and that had required something specific to rebuild it, a place that met her honestly, a man who loved her in the structural way, the way that showed in daily choices rather than declarations, a town that had watched her arrive as a stranger and had become, one Saturday dinner and one lending library and one quilt and one honest conversation at a time, the place where she had grown up for the 2nd time. Cecil found her in the kitchen garden one evening in the spring of 1894, their 3 children variously occupied inside, and he stood behind her with his arms around her and his chin resting on her head, and they looked out at the cottonwood trees along the creek, enormous now, older than their marriage by decades and indifferent to the human story playing out beneath them, and he said, "What are you thinking?" "That I almost went to San Antonio," she said. "I think about that too," he said. "I think about it every so often. What do you think when you think about it?" "I think that I would have sent a letter to every stage station on the San Antonio road asking if anyone had seen a woman with a carpetbag and a talent for land deed analysis," he said, and she laughed, genuinely and freely, the way she had learned to do again in this place. "You would not have," she said. "I absolutely would have," he said. "I had already decided you were necessary." She turned and looked up at him in the spring evening light, this man she had not expected, in this town she had not expected, in this life she had stopped allowing herself to expect. "I love you, Cecil Bailey," she said. "I love you, Ida Pritchard Bailey," he said. He still used both names sometimes, her maiden name and her married name together, and she had understood early on that it was because he knew what the name Pritchard meant, knew the survival and the losses and the hard-won knowledge it represented, and he wanted her to know that he saw all of it, not just the woman she had become here but the woman she had been before, the woman who had built herself back from nothing twice over. The cottonwoods moved in the evening breeze off the creek. Inside, James was shouting something at me and me was shouting something back, and small Thomas was probably organizing his wooden blocks by size with the focused intensity he brought to everything, and Rogelio was in the barn doing the evening check, and the horses were in the corral, and Cedar Ridge stood solid in the gathering dusk exactly as it had stood for 14 years, built by the hands of the man standing behind her, and now also, in every way that counted, built by hers. She had come to Dusthaven with nothing but a carpetbag and the depleted remnants of a faith in good things. She had left it briefly and come back. She had let herself be seen and had not been destroyed by being seen, which was the thing she had been most afraid of, the revelation of her history and her damage, and the secret fear that she was too broken to be loved without reservation. She had been wrong about that. She had been wrong about all of it in the best possible way. The town had proved her wrong. The ranch had proved her wrong. This man, steady and patient and unfailingly present, had proved her wrong with such consistency, and over such a long period that the wrongness had become the new truth, the bedrock of everything, the thing she built her days on without thinking about the building. She had stopped believing in fresh starts, and then Dusthaven had given her one, and Cecil Bailey had helped her believe in it before she had known she needed his help. And now the fresh start was 7 years old and had 3 children and a full lending library in the sitting room, and accounts that balanced and a kitchen garden that she had planted with the intention of harvesting for many years to come. She was home. She was fully, irrevocably, joyfully home. And she had needed to be proved wrong by a town and a rancher to find it, and she was not sorry for a single mile of the road that had brought her here, not even the miles that had hurt, because all of them together had led to this spring evening, this man's arms, this impossible and ordinary and completely true happiness. The stars came out over Cedar Ridge, the same stars as always, indifferent and vast and beautiful, and Ida Bailey stood in her kitchen garden and let herself be held, and did not wait for anything to be taken away, because she had learned, finally, that some things were simply yours to keep.